So this panel is about how to get into VR without sickness and on a budget. I'm Gerald McAllister. I've been doing VR and AR for about 15 years now. So quick little outline of what we're going to go over is just a little bit about me. I'm going to kind of get ahead of the why aren't you talking about this headset or this experience or this thing. We'll go into what is a VR. We'll talk about why sim sickness is a thing and how to prevent it. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. This panel's an hour long. I'm going to try and save 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. But folks, if you have questions ahead of time, like feel free to throw up a hand. I'm really kind of chill in terms of that, and especially since it's just me up here, I see no reason that you all can't ask questions in the middle of this as well. I'm sure there are going to be plenty. Let's dig into who I am. I'm a recent father with a passion for video games and technology, and I've been working on this kind of stuff for at least 15 years. Those last two photos over there are from 2009. The second to the right with the Mario looking thing on it is actually like an old Nintendo DS Club Nintendo Mario album, and that's like an old feature tracking algorithm I wrote back in 2009. It was kind of fun to play with. The rightmost one, you can kind of see this purple guy standing in front of a Nintendo DS. That's some augmented reality I played with back then. So both of those predate any of the smartphones that folks have in this room, and I think it even predates the iPhone. So yeah, it's been a while that I've been doing this. So I've used a lot of headsets. Played a ton of games and a ton of different headsets. I am always hesitant to call myself an expert in anything, but I would say this is probably the thing I feel closest to being considered an expert in. And in recent years, I actually use this headset here pretty much to work in. I work for anywhere from 2 to 4 hours a day in a headset, actually until the battery dies usually. Chris here and I watched the first two Sonic movies entirely in a headset, so 4+ hours in it. I play Steam games regularly on it, so like I'm in the headset a good chunk of time. And a quick disclaimer, because I feel this is necessary before we get into this, I do work for Meta. I do work on VR headsets during my day job. I'm going to recommend some non-Meta headsets too for folks who are curious, but I do feel the need to kind of get that out of the way that I do work for them. But this panel is not about that. I will say there will be probably some controversial takes, but please give me time to explain my reasoning before we jump into them. And let's get started with, what about X? There's going to be a lot of things I'm not going to talk about in this talk, and a lot of things that folks are probably thinking, like, aren't there other headsets out there? Or I tried VR before and I got sick, why try again? I'm sure a lot of folks have seen the term mixed reality or other terms being thrown around out there that maybe you're not really interested in, you're really focused on VR, or again, headsets I'm not recommending. This is kind of a conglomeration of all those things, right? Those top two, Google Cardboard and Windows Mixed Reality, a lot of folks have probably tried those because they were cheap and everywhere. If you've tried those and you're like, that's the last time I tried VR and you're not sure if you'll like it today, I promise you, the VR headsets of today are a totally different beast. It's like saying I tried a smartphone in the late 90s. It might have been a good phone at the time, but it is not worth comparing to today. Those two headsets in the middle, those are the Vive Cosmos and the Pimax 5K something. I'm not going to talk about these headsets. Google literally just bought up HTC's dev team, so like I've been saying for years, I'm not a huge believer that HTC is going to be around for a while, and Google buying up their dev team kind of starts to solidify that. So we'll talk about one HTC headset, but it's more for comparison's sake, not necessarily for recommendations. Pimax has some troubles in terms of stability. A big thing that I'm focused on with this talk is stability. I don't want to give y'all recommendations or things that are not really proven technologies. And Pimax likes to really push the edge on things like field of view, but this can come at the trade-off of image quality, stability, sim sickness, a variety of other things, so we're not going to talk about them. The bottom two headsets, the Somium XR and the Visor from Immersed, are both unreleased. And I have a strict policy that I do not get into headsets that are not released, so that's why we're not going to talk about them. But again, like a stable baseline has been found. That's the focus of this talk. I'm also going to be talking about VR experiences that have kind of matured. So if there's something like brand new on the bleeding edge, I'm not really going to talk about as much. We'll probably talk about VR chat a little bit just because that is very popular. The note that I do consider that a little bit more on the experimental side, just because it does a lot of things that can be difficult for newcomers. And this is really focused on newcomers. And again, going back to that bottom point, I can't recommend what's not released, so we're not talking about those bottom ones. So what is a VR? The basic answer I like to give, because I think that people like to make it either more complex or less complex than it should be, is that it's a device for simulating reality, right? There's a lot of different ways that we can do that. We can mock the visual system, we can mock the audio systems of the ears, we can mock touch inputs and stuff, but today's headsets are generally a screen and microphones and audio for capturing and playing back audio and displays for capturing visual and cameras for capturing visuals and playing them back. There's a wide variety of options. There's some that need computers, as I'm sure many know, but there's actually a ton of options now that don't require computers at all. Also, everyone can hear me okay, right? Okay, cool. I figure I'm loud enough. And the other thing that's really cool is that VR is actually extremely budget friendly now. You can actually get a decent headset for about $300 now, and that's like brand new. You can actually get them even cheaper if you're looking online for sales and things like that. And if you do look for something older, that's also possible. But there's actually going to be 3 features that I really want to focus on for this talk. And we're going to get a little bit into the technical weeds, but I'm hoping I've distilled it down to the essence that everybody here doesn't need a technical degree to understand it. And those 3 things are going to be the visual and audio representation of things, right? We're going to kind of dig into some of that and what's important there, and especially around like preventing sim sickness and getting the highest quality experience out of it. We're going to talk about positional tracking and some of the things around that, like controllers, hand tracking, and other things, and some of the things to consider with that. And the other thing we're going to talk about is proper balance. I forgot, unfortunately, to bring the bad head strap, so I only have a good one to show good balance. I can't easily show bad balance, unfortunately, but I can at least try and mimic what that would look like. And so we'll dig into this. Like I said before at the start, though, if anybody has any questions or thoughts, you're welcome to raise your hand and I can answer questions or hear thoughts as we go. But before we jump into these 3 key features, I do want to go ahead and just give a general overview of the industry and my personal recommendations on it. We're going to talk about 6 primary headsets, which you can actually see the visuals of on this previous slide. The Quest 3S, the Quest 3, the Apple Vision Pro, the Valve Index, PSVR 2, and Big Screen Beyond. We're also going to bring up the Oculus Rift, HTC Vive, and Quest 2. Note that all 3 of those are discontinued, but I'm bringing them up because I think a lot of people have heard of them or maybe even tried them, and I think they're a good comparison. Real quick show of hands, actually, how many people here have tried like an Oculus Rift or newer? How many folks have like never tried VR at all before? And how many folks have only tried like Google Cardboard or like a really cheap phone headset or something? Okay. So yeah, so Oculus Rift and HTC Vive are kind of the general standard baseline of quality. Most headsets will at least match that quality. But you'll notice that this chart covers a couple of things. There's a big thing around standalone headsets versus PC VR only. So for example, the Oculus Rift and HTC Vive were both PC VR headsets only. You needed a very expensive at the time computer to run them. And so while the headsets might have been $300, $400 on a good day, they were going to require a probably $1,000 computer to run at the time as well. So your total in cost was about $1,500. And there are still PC VR only headsets that are out there today. Big Screen Beyond is the most common one now. The Valve Index is apparently discontinued. You can buy the headset, the controllers, and the base stations individually from Valve, but you can't buy a bundle, and the total cost to get the same setup is about $1,100 instead of $1,000 now. Yeah?
I was going to say there's literally a bundle right now on the Steam store.
I actually literally just checked on it, and it says sold out for the Valve Index bundle. Really? Yeah, and there's actually rumors that they've just stopped building it. I don't know the validity of this, but the person, there's a guy named, sadly, it's Bradley on Twitter, if anybody's ever watched any of his videos, but he is saying that they've discontinued it, and I don't know, we'll see. But there are rumors around them releasing a new headset, and this is a big reason why you'll notice the Valve Index. I actually don't really recommend it. There's actually other things we're going to talk about here in terms of the specs and stuff that I also think make it a difficult deal. But the fact between the specs and the fact that it doesn't look like the bundle is for sale, and that Valve is rumored to be working on something new, and they're rumored to be discontinuing it, I just can't recommend it now. The three that I can recommend, if you want standalone, the Quest 3 and Quest 3S are basically the best options, your best bang for buck, right? The 3S is going to be $300. The Quest 3 is going to be $500. The big difference is going to be with the Quest 3, you have an adjustable interpupillary distance, so you can actually get if your eyes are separated more or less than some other folks, you can actually get a much better visual quality with the 3 and the 3S. The 3S only has 3 options for IPD, so that's the difference in the price jump there. There's also Fresnel lenses and other things that come into play and other specs that we're going to talk about later. But those two are basically identical outside of that, the same processor, both PCVR compatible. Now, one thing you'll note, though, is that the Quest 3 and 3S and Apple Vision Pro are the only 3 headsets that have built-in audio. So if you want audio playback on your PSVR 2 or your big screen beyond, you'll actually have to buy headphones separately, and that can have a big impact on the experience just because connecting wires in and everything else can be a pain. In terms of the Vision Pro and PSVR 2, I put those as maybe. The PSVR 2 is pretty easy. If you have a PlayStation 5, it's a pretty easy one to recommend there if you want to play some games with it. There's a PC VR adapter, so you can use it on your PC as well. But if you don't have a PS5, then PSVR 2 is harder to recommend because it's like, well, you have to buy a $500 game system and a $550 headset, so you're talking about almost $1,000 just to play the thing at that stage. So it kind of just depends if you want to get into that ecosystem or not. Same thing, though, honestly, with Quest and headsets as well. The Vision Pro is an interesting one. You'll notice I put maybe there as well, and the reason for that is the Vision Pro is really, really good if you're playing flat games. If you're doing something like just having a normal gamepad, like an Xbox controller, and you're just playing flat games on a TV, it's really awesome for that. But it struggles a little bit when you start moving around due to OLED issues. It can have a blurring effect. I know friends who have had no sim sickness in any other headset except the Vision Pro because of that. But it really varies person to person. It's also extremely expensive at $3,500, and that's just the base headset with I think 256 gigs of memory. If you go up from there, it quickly escalates in price. It also doesn't have controllers. It has game pads, but not controllers. And so you're going to be limited in the types of things you can do. There are companies trying to build controllers for it, but it's dependent on the apps to support them. So you're not going to get VR chat natively running on the headset with those controllers unless VR chat adds support for those controllers on their own. So this is why I put it as maybe. It's a very kind of niche headset right now. It is a great experience. It's very awesome for watching movies and playing Steam games on with Steam Link, but it is a very specific type of device. If you just want to get into PC VR, if you don't care about standalone and you kind of want to stay away from the Meta ecosystem and you just want to stay with Steam, the Big Screen Beyond is really awesome. It's a very nice headset. It is custom fit to your face, so it's hard to share with friends and family. So that's one thing to keep in mind. It's also fairly expensive at $1,000. And it doesn't come with the things you need to use it. You have to go to Valve to buy base stations and controllers separately. So that $1,000 is just the headset. And it's a big reason that, I kind of mention here that I recommend it if you want PC VR, but it's missing just a lot of little things that you might enjoy. The other thing that I want to call out too is this mixed reality column. I think a lot of folks underestimate that. Again, I mentioned that I'm a father because there's a lot of times that I'll be playing games in the headset and I need to keep an eye on my kid. And the ability to be able to play games on a giant screen and see my kid out of the corner of my eye is a huge selling point for mixed reality. And that's only possible on headsets that are standalone, unfortunately. So that's basically the Quest headsets or the Apple Vision Pro. The other headsets don't have a way to do this. The Valve Index can kind of fake it. They have cameras that can pass through, but it's not true mixed reality, and so it is harder to kind of keep an eye on a kid running around in the background as a result of that. Yeah, so this is my recommendations list. We'll get more into the specs of everything in just a second here, but I did want to just get this out of the way so that as we talk about things, it'll make more sense of why I recommend some things and why I don't recommend the others. So let's talk about visuals and audio. This is a really interesting one because a lot of folks think that the only thing that matters with headsets is the resolution, right? A 4K per eye headset is gonna be better than a 2K per eye headset. But that's actually not the full story. One of the really tough things about virtual reality headsets is that you're not looking at a flat display, you're looking at a curved display because of the lenses that are in the headset. And so if you think about looking at a phone, right, a lot of folks may have heard the term pixels per inch, PPI. That represents how many pixels are in a single inch on your display. So a phone might have somewhere around 500 plus, PPI, right? But this doesn't work in VR because you're looking at it so close up that other factors come into play. And it's kind of like trying to judge a TV, right? If you're sitting right up against a 1080p TV, you're gonna see those pixels. It's gonna look blurry because you're sitting so close to this TV. If you up the resolution to 4K, it's gonna look much better even though you're sitting so close. This is what's known as pixels per degree, or PPD. It's a really important specification that's affected by a whole variety of things, like how close to the screen you are, the angle at which you're sitting, the type of cover that's on top of the display. The actual display itself actually has an impact on the pixels per degree. And the best example of this, in my opinion, is OLED versus LCD versus micro OLED. A lot of folks like to say OLED is the best display tech. There's no reason to use LCD. You see this a lot with folks talking about like Steam Deck, right, versus or the Nintendo Switch 2 that was just announced, where it's like, why aren't they using OLED? But OLED actually has a pretty big drawback in VR, which is the separation of the pixels is much larger. You can see in that top right image, right, OLED, traditional OLED all the way on the left and micro OLED on the right, both have these large black gaps that present themselves in between the pixels, whereas LCD, the pixels are much closer together. What this means is that you get more of a screen door effect at a higher resolution sometimes with micro LED than you would with LCD, simply because those pixels are closer together. So it's really important when we're talking about what makes a good VR headset that we don't just think in terms of resolution, but that we look at the specifications as a whole and think about them as one big thing. So that bottom one is a kind of the common image where it's like, the Varo XR4 is the highest resolution one, and the Vision Pro is next. And then up here, I don't even know what that one is because I can't read it because the resolution's too low. But the point of this is that resolution is one part of a variety of factors you should look at when looking at a headset. The other thing too is latency. We're going to talk a lot about frames per second. Some headsets can actually go as high as 144 frames per second. It's a big reason why I use my Quest 3 as my main monitor these days, because the frame rate on it is honestly pretty awesome for gaming. The other thing too to keep in mind is that Bluetooth headphones are a bad idea. We talked at the beginning about how some headsets don't have built-in audio, and that means that you might think, oh, well, I'll just get wireless headphones. But you have to be careful because if you get Bluetooth headphones, you're adding on latency, and that can actually sometimes cause nausea in some people simply because of the extra delay there is with wireless headphones like Bluetooth. Now, you can get transmitters that do over like a normal megahertz frequency or something, or gigahertz frequency that's much faster and gives a lower latency audio experience, but then you have an adapter that you're plugging in and other things. So there's some trade-offs with each of those. But I would generally avoid Bluetooth headphones. The one exception to this is the Apple Vision Pro with Apple's newer AirPods. They have a proprietary protocol that allows them to do extremely low latency audio on the Vision Pro. And so in that scenario, it's actually pretty good experience. But most other devices right now don't have that, simply because developing that proprietary protocol is on Apple. There are some open source options, or not open source, but like solutions that other companies are providing that are starting to become a thing. But you have to remember that you need a VR headset that supports that protocol, and you need headphones that support that protocol. So if one of them doesn't, then the experience will be bad. So I would generally just avoid Bluetooth. So let's actually compare some headsets and look at some numbers and actually put them into perspective for what each headset has. One thing to note, I've tried my best to make these numbers as accurate as possible, but there's a lot of these that are really hard to find. For example, the field of view is a great one where a lot of companies will say, this is our field of view, but it's actually the diagonal, which is generally larger than the others. Or they'll put like just the vertical field of view if they don't like a headset because it's smaller. I've tried very specifically to do the horizontal field of view. So from left to right, what is that field of view, since that's the one a lot of folks like to focus on. Vertical for most headsets is pretty much the same. So the horizontal is where you'll see a lot of variety. And again, we have the Oculus Rift and HTC Vive at the top just because those are kind of a good baseline. And so let's kind of run through these numbers real quick. The original Rift and Vive both had a PPD about 10 pixels per degree. Which is generally where everybody kind of saw the screen door effect, right? You look at it and it's like looking through a screen door and just seeing the individual pixels really pop out at you. And a big part of this was actually two things. One, they were using 1080p screens, I believe. I think the Valve index might have been slightly higher, but not by much. And so again, you had much fewer pixels than what we have on headsets today. But the other issue too is that they had those OLED displays, right? And so you had these much larger gaps in between the individual pixels of those headsets. An interesting note about this, the original PlayStation VR, they actually solved that gap in the pixels by using a different layout of the pixels. And so they built custom panels that were able to have less of that effect. So they actually looked better even though they were the same display resolution. But that's just the original PlayStation VR 1. PSVR 2 now uses the more traditional pixel layout simply because, probably because it was cheaper. The other thing you'll note too is that they only supported 90 hertz for the frame rate, and the field of view of the Rift was about 87 degrees. Interestingly, the Vive was supposedly 110. I feel like it was probably a little bit less. It's kind of hard to say on that, but this is generally what I've seen online, so I'm kind of supporting the consensus there. Again, this is something to keep in mind that those numbers are kind of hazy. The newer the headset, the more likely those numbers are going to be more accurate. So the interesting one is Quest 2. How many folks here have tried like a Quest 2, for example? Okay, so a couple folks. So Quest 2 is probably the one that that kind of solidified a very good baseline for a lot of things, right? It's a 21 pixels per degree headset. It's LCD instead of OLED, so that meant that the pixels per degree were actually a little bit nicer, both because of a much higher screen resolution and because you had that better pixel packing that was going on. The lenses is the other thing too. A lot of headsets, as time has gone on, the type of lens that's used most commonly is called a Fresnel lens. There's a slow transition to something called a pancake lens. So the way to think of a Fresnel lens is that it is shaped in such a way that it focuses light to a point. That's why you'll notice in a lot of those headsets, the center looks very clear, but the edges look very blurry. Pancake lenses are more head-on, so they have more bounces. It means that the displays are going to look less bright because there's more light bouncing, but because it's more head-on, you don't end up with the edges being as blurry. But that also has an effect on the pixels per degree because pancake lenses have a higher clarity than Fresnel lenses as a result. But also over time, Fresnel lenses have gotten better, and so as they've gotten better, we're seeing the PPD increase as well. So the Quest 2, interestingly, also supported 4 different frame rates. It supported a 72 hertz frame rate, which was meant to be like, again, it's running off a mobile chip. It's a standalone device, so 72 hertz is a lot easier to manage the processing power on. And it is divisible by 24. So if you're watching a movie that's running at 24 frames per second, you don't get these glitches in frames. It's a very specific reason why that number was chosen. 80 and 90 and 120, those are where you're going to play most games. Those are the more traditional ones. 90 is interesting because it's perfectly divisible by 30 FPS, right? So you're going to look very nice if you're doing like 30 FPS gaming on it. But the 120 is actually the most interesting to me because 120 is divisible by 60, 30, and 24. So if you have 120 hertz, 120 frames per second running on your headset, it's actually really nice because you can watch a movie, play games, do anything in it, and it's always going to look nice. The reason I say this is that if you're doing something like watching a movie at 24 frames per second, but the headset's refresh rate is running at 90 frames per second, what you'll see is every now and then you'll lose a few frames. It'll kind of look like a skip or a glitch or a hiccup almost in the playback because of that. So that's why these frame rates matter. Quest 3, Quest 3S both continue that trend of LCD and of the same frame rate support. There's an increase in pixels per degree on the Quest 3 simply because of the fact that we are using pancake lenses instead of Fresnel lenses these days. The Quest 3S, though, in order to save on cost, uses Fresnel lenses. So you get a slightly lower pixel per degree count, but it's a much better processor and other things with it. The field of view is the other interesting one for these headsets. So the HTC Vive was pretty good at 110 degrees, but the Quest 2 took a step down to 96 degrees. And the interesting thing is by lowering the field of view, right, how far you're able to see, when you have less of that, that means you have more of your screen, your display, to use for that field of view, which increases your pixels per degree. So by lowering the field of view, you increase the PPD. This is why, while Quest 2 might have a lower field of view, it has a higher PPD. This is where Quest 3 is so neat because Quest 3 has a higher field of view, as high as a Valve HTC Vive, but then it has a 15 PPD higher, basically, right? It is a significantly higher resolution display. That combined with being LCD over OLED means that you get that really nice pixels per degree. The Quest 3S, though, has that trade-off. It's the same as the Quest 2, so it's, again, kind of doing the same trade-offs as the Quest 2 did. The Vision Pro is a really interesting one. So the Vision Pro uses 4K per eye displays, and they're micro OLED. So micro OLED has better pixel density than an OLED, and so you get a really high PPD at 34 PPD. The field of view is a little bit more limited as well, so that helps to make that better. It's estimated to be 100 degrees. Apple has not officially released numbers, and it doesn't look like many measurements have happened. But again, that's horizontal field of view. And the interesting thing is Apple decided to go with 90 and 96 hertz for refresh rates. Again, that 96 is coming into play because of the movie playback, right? If you're playing back a movie at 24 frames per second, 96 is divisible by that. And so for Apple, they decided to be very simple on this, right? You have 90 for games, you have 96 for movies and TV. The Valve Index is a really interesting one. So the Valve Index only has 11 PPD. You'll notice it's using LCD like the Quest 2 is, but it was released 2 years, I believe, before 1 year. I think it was 1 or 2 years before the Quest 2 was released. And so the display resolution was significantly lower. And then on top of that, they stretched the field of view to 108 degrees. So the combination of stretching the field of view using a lower resolution display just means that they unfortunately have a much lower PPD at 11. This is a big reason why it's very hard for me to recommend them, simply because they're so much lower than everyone else that's on this list. Now, the one thing that they do have, which is worth keeping in mind, is that they have a really, really nice set of refresh rates, because they have 80, 90, 120, and they also have 144 frames per second refresh rate. If you hear me at some point, by the way, say 144 hertz instead, that's the more technical term that's used. It's the same thing. I'm trying to use this just to keep this talk more simple, but same exact thing. So 144 hertz or frames per second, that can have an impact on sim sickness. There are some folks out there who are so susceptible to simulator sickness that extra boost in frame rate can actually make the experience better. So it is something that's worth trying out. It's a big reason why trying these headsets can be a big deal. That said, I think it's pretty rare, and in my experience, I've never actually met somebody who has it. I've heard of it, but I've never actually met someone, and I'm curious what types of games they're playing to trigger it. Going on, so you have PSVR 2. PSVR 2 kind of sits in between. It's a little over 2K per eye. It's an 18 PPD display, or a setup as a result. It's using micro OLED for the display type, and it does 90 and 120 hertz refresh. The field of view is also 110 degrees. They're not using pancake lenses. They're using Fresnel lenses, but they're kind of pushing them to the absolute limits of that technology. And so they're doing a pretty good job on that. It's a pretty well put device. One thing to, and before we go into the trade-offs, Big Screen Beyond. So Big Screen Beyond is a really nice headset. It is 32 pixels per degree, so almost on par with the Apple Vision Pro. It's also micro OLED, so you're going to get the nice colors. So they're kind of, again, squeezing it really for the most they can. And the field of view on it is, again, 102 degrees, so it's a pretty solid field of view. A big thing with Big Screen Beyond is that, again, they're custom order to fit your face. So they are very much focused on kind of providing the best experience they can for what you're going to get. It's more expensive, but if you're only planning to play PC or VR games and you don't mind a wire, it is an incredible experience for that purpose. That's one thing I just realized I didn't talk about in this is wires. Probably fairly easy to understand, but if you buy a headset that needs a PC, you're going to have a wire attached to your computer with it. The Quest 2, Quest 3, and Quest 3S, all three do have support for wired connections, but they also have support for wireless connections to a PC. So that is something to consider, is if you want a wireless PC VR experience, you can get that with those headsets. PSVR 2 is a wired experience, and yeah. So, and so this is kind of the baseline specs. The one thing to note when it comes to visuals especially is everything's a trade-off. No headset here is perfect, right? The Quest 2 and Quest 3S, right, we talked about it, they have a switch for the IPD, so if your IPD falls out of the range of those headsets, it's probably not going to be a great experience. Whereas the Big Screen Beyond, PSVR 2, and Apple Vision Pro, they both will have a potential for blurring at high brightnesses. This has to do with an effect that OLEDs can have, where at high brightnesses, the pixels persist for longer, and it creates a smearing effect that you see across the screen, which can cause sim sickness. I think Big Screen Beyond has the least issue with this, PSVR 2 has the most issue with this, and Apple Vision Pro is kind of in between, more experience dependent. And then, obviously, what we've talked about, the Vision, the Apple Valve Index, PSVR 2, and Big Screen Beyond all require additional hardware. You need a PC or a PlayStation 5 in order to be able to use them. So. Again, if anybody has questions, you're welcome to chime in at any point. Positional tracking. So when you are using a headset, right, and you're moving around, the headset has to keep track of where you are. At this point, this is a pretty well-solved issue. Inside-out tracking is actually the standard. Contrary to what you might think, every headset uses inside-out tracking. While the Valve Index does use base stations and the Big Screen Beyond, they both use base stations, right? That's why they have them required. What actually happens is the base stations shoot out lasers around your room, and then there are infrared cameras on the headset that look for those patterns on the ground. It's kind of like the old Nintendo Wii Remote trick of having a camera on the Wii Remote and an infrared bar. The Wii Remote has the camera, not the bar. And it's the same thing with these headsets. The Valve Index and the Big Screen Beyond have little itty-bitty cameras on the headset to track those lasers bouncing around. The only exception to this list is the Oculus Rift. The original Oculus Rift actually had cameras that you'd place on your desk like these microphones, and that would track the headset and the controllers. That's no longer the case. But yeah, at this day and age, if you're buying a headset, it's going to be inside-out tracking. The big thing is that PC VR, everyone is using Steam VR tracking, so you're really not going to find any alternatives now. It used to be that you had Windows mixed reality headsets that did their own tracking stuff, and it was pretty bad, so Microsoft stopped it. And yeah, so the big thing is, so a couple of things to consider with tracking. Controllers. So all of these headsets include controllers except the Vision Pro, and the Big Screen Beyond. The Vision Pro does not support track controllers. So track controllers look like this. They're good for Beat Saber and games like that. But they are not included with the Vision Pro. There's companies working on some of them, but it's kind of to be seen how that'll do. They do support gamepads though. So again, if you want to play like, Super Smash Brothers remote on your Switch or something, or do something remote on Steam VR or something, I don't know. You can connect a controller to your headset and you can play it that way, and it's a pretty good experience. Big Screen Beyond does support controllers, but again, it doesn't include them, so you do have to buy them separate. Another thing to consider too is that these controllers are very different from a Wii Remote. I think that's the general comparison a lot of people think is, yeah, it's just like, waggle, Wii Remote waggle. This is actually fully tracked. So when you go to like pick up an object, you actually reach out and pick it up. You don't just throw the controller at it. So it is something to consider too. The other thing that's worth thinking about is hand tracking. I think hand tracking is something that a lot of folks think, I don't need that. And it's true. If you just want to play normal VR games, you don't really need it. Controllers are much better, in my opinion, for traditional VR gaming. But when you're playing a Steam game, so for example, if I am playing Phasmophobia on my Steam, via Steam Link on my headset, one of the things you have to do before you join a room with a friend is you have to enter that room code. And doing so with mouse and keyboard is fine, but doing so with a gamepad is a bit of a pain. The cool thing is with hand tracking, you can actually use the display as a touch screen, so you can just tap the numbers to put that in. And so, to me, hand tracking actually improves the gaming experience on PC VR, or on PC game streaming, because I can just tap, tap, tap to do a bunch of things and I'm done. Same with navigating menus and other things. So I do think it's worth considering if it has hand tracking. Again, Quest 2, Quest 3, Quest 3S, and Vision Pro all have hand tracking. The PC VR headsets don't. So, I mean, that's just kind of the standard here right now. But yeah, that's a bit of tracking. The final thing is balancing. This is, I think, probably the most important thing to think about. A lot of people think that the best thing for a headset is for it to be lighter. And being lighter is important. Like, do not get me wrong. If you can make a headset lighter, that is the ideal goal. But generally speaking, making it lighter comes at the trade-off of power, display quality, etc. So what can we do instead? Well, the better thing, in my opinion, is actually figuring out a way to make the headset more balanced. Now, the Quest 3, for example, normally comes with a soft head strap that when you wear it is very front heavy. So that all of the pressure of the headset is going to be resting on your face with a normal head strap. But this one, if you notice, this is a rigid head strap, and it actually has a battery in the back too for extra battery life, so it's better balance. So if I hold this with my finger here, right, it stays in the middle. Normally it would be leaning forward like this with a soft head strap. It's very uncomfortable. And this can be the difference between wanting to put it on for 30 minutes or 4 hours for me, easily. And there's actually even other head strap types. Again, I personally am using this just because work. But other headsets like Bobo VR are very common. You'll see that they support battery options as well, and they actually try to take the pressure off of your face entirely. They have headsets that'll basically make it so it's mostly on your forehead and on the back of your head and removes it off of your face entirely, and that can be much more comfortable for some folks. Again, I'd highly recommend one with a battery pack because it not only gives you extra battery life, but it also helps to counterbalance the weight better. Now, the one downside is that PC VR headsets, you generally don't have as many options. Those headsets are lighter, they don't have as much in them, so you generally, I don't think hear folks needing it as much, but it is something to consider. One thing to note about both of these pictures, so the bottom left is kind of a normal picture of the counterbalance, but the top one, they've actually taken a Quest 3 head strap and they've modified it to work on a Vision Pro because only Apple sells their own head straps, and they don't really have as many options right now as the Quest does. The bottom one is really funny because if you look, it's kind of sagging in the back. They put a bunch of weights on the back. That's literally all that is a normal Quest or Oculus Rift head strap or Quest head strap. Original Quest 1, modified to have weights on the back so that it counterbalances better, right? And this is the thing, it's kind of counterintuitive, but a heavier headset can actually be more comfortable because of that counterbalancing effect. These are the places at the bottom where you can get additional accessories. Bobo VR is kind of what I would recommend for most accessories just because they have hot swappable batteries, they support a wide variety of headsets with those batteries, so on and so forth. They make really, really nice head straps. Both Meta and Apple official ones are fine. Like, I don't think they're bad, but I do think that Bobo VR, you'll get a little bit more bang for buck on it. Let's talk about sim sickness. First off, simulation sickness is different from motion sickness. Motion sickness comes from if you're in a car and you see the car is moving, right, but you're looking at a book. It comes from your body physically moving, but your brain saying that you're not. It's a mismatch, right? Simulation sickness is the opposite. Your brain says that your body is moving, but your body says, I'm not moving. The theory is that this is actually due to our brains developing a way to try and counteract poison. Basically, if you felt that your brain and your body were mismatching in some way, the goal is to make you sick to get rid of the poison. But that's just the theories. But basically, there's three key things that come into play on this. The biggest one, in my opinion, is your games. Beware of your games. If you play a bad game with it, we'll go into some examples, it will make you sick. Beware of your tech. Some headsets and some specs will make you sick if you're not careful as well. And also just be aware of yourself. We'll give some tips on dealing with motion sickness here as well. So the games. Anything that moves your body artificially, so like a roller coaster, is probably going to make you sick. It just is the kind of the way it is. You can build, some people can build a tolerance, but it's very, very hard to, and you have to do it repeatedly. But generally speaking, if you're artificially moving in the game, it will make you sick. There are some types of artificial movement that can be done, and you actually might be okay. Moving at a constant speed, so not speeding up or slowing down, right? You just move and stop, actually can be better for it. Having things that remain fixed in your field of view to ground you, right? So a HUD or something can help with this. There's also other tricks that games will do, like shrinking the field of view. So by shrinking the field of view, you can actually kind of create more grounding and make sim sickness less of an issue. But there's some things that, like artificial movement, if it does it, like just avoid. Any up and down, right? The up and down movement, so like jumping, pretty much everyone I've ever met gets very sick from that. Accelerating and decelerating, like we said, that'll do it. And rotating the player in weird ways. If you just rotate the player, so like left to right is generally okay, but if you rotate them like this, it is one of the most nauseating things I've ever experienced. And I've been doing this for a while. And you can actually see some examples of good and bad up there that I've kind of put up. Beat Saber and Pistol Whip are two very classic experiences that are just, they're very well designed to not make you sick. Beat Saber is like my go-to for this. The roller coaster on the right, yeah, no, absolutely not. It's horrible. The other one under there is Doom, and the reason I put that on there is if you notice, they actually go up some stairs in a little bit there. And that might look fine on this display, but in VR, that'll make a lot of people really sick really fast. There's also just a lot going on there. Fast-paced action, it's interesting. Half-Life Alyx was a very slow-paced game, and that worked really well. You don't need a lot of fast action in VR because when you're actually physically doing things like reloading a gun, it can be already stressful enough. The one I put in the middle there is Skyrim VR at the bottom for PlayStation VR. You'll notice when they move, actually, the screen, the display, the corners get smaller, right? It kind of fades in black. That's called vignetting. It's a way to shrink the field of view and prevent sickness. So a game like that, it kind of depends on the person. Some people will still get sick from that, but others might actually be okay. It's one of those things that's just, it's tough to say. Personally, I can do those games for about an hour or two, and then I might start feeling a little sick, but again, it's person to person dependent for those kinds of experiences. The tech. This is pretty basic. On the left, modern headsets are going to be really good. On the right, Google Cardboard is going to make you puke real quick. Windows Mixed Reality isn't great either. Its tracking algorithms generally stuttered and stuff, so you might be standing still and then it'd jump. Vision Pro, again, I put in the middle because if you're doing a game where, if you're doing a screen, right, if you're watching a movie, it's fine for that. But when you start walking around with it, it can be a little disorienting due to a bunch of trade-offs that were made on the displays, the cameras, and other things. They fixed it in some updates, so it's a little better, but it's still, to me, in the middle. Yeah, most modern headsets are fine, but they still can have trade-offs that might affect you. We talked a little about the different lens types, pancakes versus Fresnel. Pancake lenses can actually suffer from something that's known as pupil swim. It's effectively where to phrase it simply, it looks like the things are swimming. It looks like they're kind of floating around and not super stable. And this can make some folks sick. It's generally pretty much fixed now, but some folks, it's just ever so slightly there on some devices, and some folks are very susceptible, so that can have an effect. We also talked before about like micro OLED. When you have a very high brightness on them, the displays can kind of have a blurriness that can make folks sick as well. And again, refresh rates, that's another thing to keep in mind. Higher refresh rate is generally going to be better. 90 frames per second is generally the standard in VR these days, so you'd be hard pressed to find something that doesn't have it. But yeah. And you. Everyone's different. Everyone's going to have some different levels of comfort with sim sickness. Don't worry. Some folks can adapt, not everyone. Keep that in mind. The big thing that I want to make a recommendation is that if you start feeling sick, do not power through. This is not something to power through on. It will just get worse. And simulation sickness, if you haven't had a bad case of it, it can last for hours. It is miserable. It is extremely unfun. So highly, highly recommend if you're starting to feel it, give it a stop, take some time, wait until you're fully reset. And if you've never experienced a VR headset before, make sure your first experience is a good one. Use good hardware. Start with games that are simple. Stop if you feel sick. The other thing I'd recommend is try mixed reality if you can. Mixed reality is pretty good for that. Though do be warned, some folks are more susceptible to the mismatches of mixed reality, so that can have a weird effect. This is generally my go-to setup, right, is a Quest 3, the battery head strap, Beat Saber as a first game, and the bottom right is actually an animated GIF of a mixed reality like board game, so you can see the real world behind it, but then you can still interact with the board game on the table. With that, we are at the 15-minute mark for questions. I think I saw your hand in the back first. Yeah.
So for me, occasionally when I get motion sickness, like I'll take motion sickness medicine,
Mhm.
that will help.
Yep.
Thoughts on that? Or like alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dramamine, I think, is a very common motion sickness medication. Again, sim sickness and motion sickness are different, so I don't personally know enough about how motion sickness medication works to make a full-on recommendation, but I have heard of plenty of people saying that it can help with that. Yeah.
Any suggestions or alternatives to help deal with it, or just get feeling sick, stop?
I would say if you think you might have it, take it first and then try it. If you start getting sick, I would maybe take the medication and then take a break, wait for everything to settle, and then jump back in. Because I believe the medication lasts for a little while, so that should remain. The big thing is you don't want to get sick, take the medication, jump right back in, because you might aggravate it further, and then the medication won't have time to kick in and kind of reset you. Yeah.
In relation to that, CES was really pushing the strap you put on your hand, which gives you little small electrical shocks, which is supposedly good for motion sickness.
Yeah.
Have you heard about that? Because it was really in the news and then no one talked about it.
I've heard of it. The little like electrical shock stuff. I've heard about this for many, many years. I've never personally experienced it. I'd be very curious on how it works. Yeah. It uses what, sorry? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've heard of ones on the wrist, and I'm skeptical more on those. The ones that are more on the head are the ones that I've heard of more common, I think was what you're referring to, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, those ones are more interesting because you're basically trying to disrupt the vestibular system, the inner ear, and that's something that's being looked into by places, I'm sure, but I don't know. I have my opinions on these kinds of things that I think differ from what a lot of folks would say. Yeah, I think I saw you next. Yeah.
You mentioned first experiences with VR. Have you checked out the VR zone here at MAGFest?
Mhm.
And if so, do you think that's configured well for a good first experience for VR?
I think so. I think in general the VR zone, from what I saw, was pretty good. I was excited to see Beat Saber this year. I do think that so they're using Quest 2s, so do keep in mind it's going to have those trade-offs we talked about. But it's a great headset. I think in general it's good. I will say I think making sure to highlight which games are beginner friendly and which games maybe aren't would be a good thing to do. But yeah, it seems pretty well put together. I think back first, and then, sorry, I think you were after, but yeah, back to start.
So, I had a question regarding if you need corrective lenses or glasses, but
Ooh.
can't wear contact lenses, what's the best way to make it?
So that is a great one. I should definitely have put a slide in here about that. There is good news on this front. So mixed news, we'll put it that way. So headsets like the Quest 3, Quest 3S, Quest 2 even, actually include a glasses spacer, so you can just wear glasses in it. But Meta's also partnered with ZeniMax, I believe is the company name, to allow prescription inserts into your headset. So you can just buy those. I think they're like $50 or something. They're actually shockingly cheap and affordable. And they basically are just lenses you can slot in, and then you never need glasses in the headset. I say this because the Vision Pro does not support prescription lenses, or sorry, does not support glasses. They only support prescription lenses, so part of buying the headset is getting that done. And then there's the issue of if you're outside of the range and a whole bunch of other things. The glasses side has an interesting trade-off because if you put glasses on in the headset, you sacrifice field of view because you're now further from the display, so built-in lenses is better for getting that consistent experience. Obviously, lenses have a cost, though. I think, yeah, you were next.
That was basically my question.
Oh, okay. Chris?
Yeah. I think most people, like, when they experience VR, it's either one of two things. It's like I'm playing a video game at my house, or I'm watching media playback also at my house, or a friend's house that's like you tried your headset. What's the like most surprising use case you found for a VR headset since you've used them probably in many different like areas or use cases?
This is a really weird one, but so we were doing construction work on our house, and one of the things we were trying to do was coordinate for our attic and our main floor where we were going to put a new wall or basically between the two floors. We were trying to figure out the structural side. And so what I did was I at the time, I didn't feel like building the app, so I took a Vision Pro and I put a browser window on the bottom floor where the structural support was, walked upstairs, and then was able to look through the floor to where that browser is and map out between the two floors how that structural support was supporting the floor above. Using a browser window.
It's a very niche use case.
Right. I mean, it's an extremely niche use case, but this is the thing that was interesting to me about that because, so we had our electrician coming through, right? And he needed to lay out where all the outlets were and where the wires were gonna run. And the wires come in from the basement of this house, and then we had to have the main floor, okay, here's all the places. Right now, what he has to do is he has to basically drill a nail through the floor at every point, figure out where all the outlets are, and then put them in, and then somebody comes in and patches them up. And then if he makes the wrong mark, he has to re-drill another hole, and it's just a mess. Whereas with a headset, you could have an electrician app where he could literally go through virtually, right, scan the house, go through virtually and map everything out at home, get it all figured out, come in, already laid out, ready to go, and just get to work. So I think it is a niche use case in my situation, but I think with everybody that needs electrical work out there, it could be a pretty interesting use case, so. Thought I saw another hand go up. Yeah.
What about like MAGFest? Do those help or hinder feeling sick whenever you have like the MAGFest that are supposed to simulate bullet impacts or whatever?
Yeah, so anything that adds to the immersion and adds, so haptics an interesting one. Haptics can help with sim sickness. It's hard to say how much simply because there's, haptic vests are a very niche side of things, so a lot of the feedback you're going to get is from enthusiasts who are using the headset enough to build tolerances to sim sickness. What the findings from what I've seen say is that yes, it does help with it, but it's not clear exactly how much. It could be a little bit, it could be a lot. It's just like, is it more important than other factors, I think is the tricky question. So, yeah.
I just want to add extra detail to that because my brother and myself were fans of racing, but I just jumped on the PSVR side of things through the PS5, and he taught me a tip when I was at his house. Once you put on the headset, turn on the bed. which gives you the
Yeah.
simulation effect of your driving. So
Yep.
little tidbits here and there.
Yep.
Just
Yeah.
to get that full immersion.
Yep, yeah, like sim racing, like having a fan to simulate the wind and stuff. Exactly. Like that's the thing that's tricky with this is that like I think the answer to those things is yes, but like they add up, right? It's like every little thing adds a little bit more grounding, but at a certain point, right? Like if you're actually physically moving, right? Like if you're in a car moving at the exact speed that you're racing at, yeah, you're not going to have sickness because you're actually physically doing what it is. And so the question is how much gear do you get and how far do you go before that?
You build into it, which is funny.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned stability as being like pretty important for a stable experience. So not only the audio and visual delay synchronization, I guess, is more important. Let's say you have like you're playing on a PC, you don't have as great hardware as like the resolution or the frame rate would support.
Yep.
Would you recommend lowering the resolution even on like a higher PPI screen or display
Yeah.
to reach a stable frame rate? Would
Yes.
that be more important than the resolution itself?
100%. Yeah. If you basically, yeah, the thing is you want, so in terms of priority, right? Stability of frame rate is the highest thing because you're going to get, let's say you can do 120 frames per second, but you're going to drop a bunch of frames every time, or you could just do 90 frames per second and it's buttery smooth. That 120 frames per second, while it might be a higher number, those drop frames, you're going to feel terrible when they hit. 90 frames per second, it's going to be buttery smooth the whole time, so it's way less. That inconsistency is kind of the thing you're trying to avoid there. So yeah, highly recommend in that case lowering down. Yeah.
Follow up with the niche use of VR. What if you're, say, a programmer? Now it's weird because let's say you're sitting down, you want to look to the left, and you got your IDE, and you have a styrofoam on the right side. With your recommendations of VR change versus the gaming use case?
Sorry, could you repeat that? So you have what on the left and right?
Say left side, you have an IDE coding.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Would your recommendations of the VR headsets change?
Oh, if I were recommending like working on like writing code in a headset and things like. Yeah. Yeah, so the thing I would recommend to keep an eye on with that is the pixels per degree. Me personally, I find that Quest 3 is like the perfect. So for me, Quest 3 and Apple Vision Pro are the best. I'm an engineer, so I write software, so I actually write code in the headset regularly. The Quest 3 and the Vision Pro are awesome for this. Vision Pro has a very high PPD, so it's really good for that. The only thing I don't like is that it doesn't do multiple displays, so I can only have one physical display. I'm a multi-display person, and so the Quest 3, you can actually do multiple separate displays. It can do virtual monitors, so I can have a single laptop, but then have 3 monitors anywhere I go with any size to them, and that's my personal choice. But yeah, they're both pretty great for that. Yeah, I would just focus on PPD.
I want to mention one thing. If you decide to do that, arrange yourself horizontally. Your neck, when you turn this way, much easier than going down.
Yeah.
You eliminate the neck strain. Actually, it was a consideration. I agree with you for both the Quest and the Vision Pro.
Yeah.
The Vision Pro provides a 2 HD5K
Yeah.
single monitor.
The-
You can have other screens that have your web browser, your video display. So
Yeah.
you can have multiple monitors.
Yeah, you can do one big display, so you can get it that way. And there's actually, people have built like open source programs to try and like hack it in. I haven't found a great solution on it yet. But yeah, highly recommend those two for that. Coding in it is kind of magical too if you're working on Android because it is an Android device. So you can literally write code and then deploy it to the headset all in once, and it's pretty cool watching it refresh live. All right. Well, we're just about at the end here. Thank you all for coming. Hope you all got a lot out of this. And yeah,